في مقابلة مع الشرق قال الرئيس المشارك الإقليمي لأسواق رأس المال والاستشارات في HSBC بانك ميدل إيست سامر دغايلي إن أسواق رأس المال في المنطقة شهدت تحولا نحو التخارجات الثانوية بسبب التقلبات الجيوسياسية وتفضيل المستثمرين فترات تعرض أقصر للمخاطر مع أداء قوي للصفقات. وأضاف أن نشاط الاكتتابات العامة مرشح للانتعاش بعد شهر رمضان مدعوما بقائمة طروحات قوية ونماذج أعمال ذات نمو وتدفقات نقدية واضحة.
2022 to 2024 saw a large issuances of IPOs coming from the region and contributing something 40 to 60% of the total IPO volumes in the Europe and Middle East and Africa region. You're right that last year we've seen a decrease to that contribution to around 25% of the total volumes. However, we have seen an increase in secondary market activity, meaning sell downs through existing listed stocks. That is a function of the geopolitical environment and the increased volatility that we've seen in the secondary markets, meaning a lot of investors and shareholders wanted to take a shorter market risk period in the market. IPOs typically tend to be in the market for a longer period, sometimes 4 to 6 weeks. Accelerated secondary sell downs are much shorter. We're talking about few days, and that exemplify stocks like ADNOC Gas, $2.8 billion that came last year, or Rasan out of Saudi Arabia, $245 million, or very recently in December we saw Adia selling down in Ooredoo in Qatar, $550 million. All of these trades have performed very well, receiving strong receptions from the market and internationally as well. As to the looking ahead, what we're expecting for 2026, our view is more of the same, because a lot of the market conditions that we saw last year will subside this year. So we expect the same activity in terms of secondary market sell down. A lot of the IPO activity, we see it picking up after Ramadan. There's a strong pipeline of IPOs coming with a strong profile, solid businesses, solid stories, more importantly, strong growth profile, promising strong cash flow as well being offered to investors, and that will pretty much open up the IPO market in our view.
ما الذي يفسر هذا التركز اليوم تحديدا تركز الطروحات في السوق الإماراتي والسوق السعودية؟ يعني نرى التركز في هذين السوقين تحديدا، ما الذي يفسر ذلك؟ هل هو حجم الاقتصاد، نوعية الشركات الجاهزة للإدراج، أم شهية المستثمر نفسه سامر؟
It's both ways, Mohammed. On one side, we have seen in the region major visionary economic transformation that started initially in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that have set the path to alignment between the government and the private sector and the investors alike around diversification, particularly in the economy, but as well as exemplified in the stock market and the representation of the economy and the GDP. That has meant that there are a lot of strong companies with strong growth profile coming to tap the stock market, either in form of selling existing equity or raising capital to expand further in their sectors. Often these are stories, again, that are solid in nature, strong business profile, but as well what we've seen specifically in the UAE, strong cash flow profile, which investors in the UAE typically like. Why that activity hasn't been as strong in the remaining of the GCC? Because a lot of the other GCC economies haven't adopted the same economic transformation and the same pace that we've seen in the UAE and KSA. Oman have caught up over the last 2 years, and we're seeing that pace increasing progressively. We are hearing that Kuwait will be next in line, specifically because of some of the activity and some of the decisions, economic decisions that are being undertaken in the market.
من خلال محفظة الاستشارات لدى HSBC في المنطقة، الوزن النسبي للقطاعات كيف يتوزع في طلبات الإدراجات؟ لأنه في النهاية الهدف من هذه الإدراجات هو التنويع وتنوع الفرص داخل الأسواق.
In terms of sector exposure, what we've seen often is that the main sectors like real estate, infrastructure and services, consumer, that are represented in the economy, I would say non-oil or non-hydrocarbon sector, have typically garnished much better reception from the investor base, because these are sectors they understand them very well, and the growth trajectory are very well understood by the market. That is complemented by a further diversification away from oil and hydrocarbon industries, which have typically been the flavor of the previous issuances in the past. This has started with the Aramco IPO and further, so a lot of petrochemical issuances. But now we're seeing stronger receptions to more diversified stories to come, to diversify further the stock exchange, which often aligns as well with the investors that they're seeking diversifications in their portfolio and how they see the growth in their wallet.
أريد أنتقل إلى إصدارات أدوات الدين في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. عام 2025 كان أعلى مستوى سنوي لهذه الأرقام. هذا الزخم هل يمكن الحفاظ عليه في 2026 وأين سيتركز أيضا بالمناسبة؟
Absolutely. I think if we look back at 2025, that was a historic year in terms of DCM issuances. We're talking about the highest year of issuances that we've seen back a few years ago was around $139 billion. Last year, we saw $191 billion of issuances coming into the region. The increase has been across all formats and all types of currency issuances, but as well, we've seen the sukuk specifically commanding something like a 50% of the volume. And specifically in that format, we've seen an increase 46% year on year. That is obviously higher than what we've seen in the overall market. As we look forward, we expect, again, more of the same in the DCM market. Further to that, we are seeing the highest amount of redemptions coming into the market in 2026. That's effectively outstanding paper that is maturing in 2026. A lot of that maturity will come in the UAE. We're going to see more and more issuances coming from Saudi Arabia, which have commanded a significant proportion or a dominant proportion of the issuances last year, and which exemplified itself into January. We've seen around $26 billion being issued out of Saudi Arabia in the form of 10 deals. We as HSBC, we've led all of them. So we expect Saudi to continue to dominate a lot of the DCM issuances going into next year, but as well the UAE catching up given the redemption profile.
لدي سؤال نوع من الفضول. متى تقولون للشركات الطرح والإدراج أفضل من اللجوء إلى أدوات التمويل أو العكس؟
First of all, it has to do with the capital structure of the companies. How does the capital structure of the company look like? Is it at a healthy level to prioritize, let's say, the bond or the loans or generally the credit? Because often you would think the cost of credit or the cost of debt is lower than the cost of equity. So to the extent the capital structure is calibrated with well resourcing in terms of debt, we would advise the company to come and tap the equity market as the second level of capital issuances. Now, something for us to know as well that most of the issuances or the IPOs that have come into the region have actually been secondary, meaning sell down of existing shares rather than raising equity capital, which, as I said, is often a higher cost of capital to tap the market into. And why it has been dominated by sell downs? Because often we find that shareholders want to access the market either to raise the profile of the company or to monetize part of their equity stake in terms of proceeds, but as well a drive for a greater, deeper access to capital in the future. So a lot of those companies that are selling down equity today wants the ability or the optionality to come to the equity market when they need that capital.
سأختم يعني هذا النقاش بسؤال مما نشهده من صورة عامة، إن كان في المنطقة إن كان عالميا. نشهد هذه التقلبات سامر، نشهد هذه التوترات الجيوسياسية. عندما أريد أن أربط الاستثمارات الأجنبية وشهيتها إن كان لإصدارات أو للطروحات، المستثمر الأجنبي المستثمر العالمي من جهة الطروحات هل يطلب عائد أكبر؟ ومن جهة الإصدارات هل يطلب خصم إضافي؟ هل يعني ما الذي يطلبه المستثمر العالمي؟ تخصيص أكبر ربما في هذه الأدوات.
First of all, we have to take a step back and think how is the region doing versus the globe. Today, the region is a higher performer on the economic spectrum, meaning the GCC economies are a standout in their economic growth versus the rest of the globe. And that means that the region will always be hot in demand for a lot of the international investors. If I am an international investor and I want to allocate my portfolio around the globe, I will have to follow growth, and I would want a greater amount of allocation in my portfolio into the region. That presented itself in the DCM market, your question previously, around the credit spreads in the region have tightened. And this is on the back not only of the strong economic profile, but as well increasing demand from locally and Asian investors into the debt instruments coming out of the region. So international investors want greater exposure into the credit profile of the region. And we've seen often that for a lot of the sovereign that have tightened very closely to the treasuries, the US treasuries. That means given the pegged US dollar nature of the currency in the region, a lot of them are looking at the region as a proxy to safe haven from a credit perspective. But on the equity side as well, given all what's happening in the globe and again the economic profile in the globe, equity investors want a greater proportion in their portfolio towards the region. And with the trend to seeing greater diversification on the exchange, a lot of the equity investors seeing greater proportion of allocation coming into the region to match that return into their profiles.